From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. Our top story tonight is about the CDC's moratorium on evictions. The United States Center for Disease Control and Prevention on Tuesday finally issued a fresh moratorium on evictions. It will last until October 3rd. The previous moratorium expired on July 31st. The new moratorium will apply to almost 90% of the people affected, but not all of them. Over 3 million Americans were at risk of eviction if the moratorium was not issued. Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Ayanna Pressley, as well as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are also part of the squad, joined Bush in the protest. President Joe Biden had allowed the eviction moratorium to expire, pointing to a Supreme Court ruling against extension without congressional action. Congresswoman Bush is a new member of a progressive group of Democratic lawmakers dubbed the Squad. She had also been homeless at one point. Last week, she introduced a bill calling on Congress to invest in ending the homelessness crisis by 2025. The resolution is called the Unhoused Bill of Rights. So far, only $3 billion of the $47 billion in federal housing aid has reached renters in need. Over 50,000 Americans have been hospitalized for COVID-19 as of Monday. This is a rate similar to that seen last summer. The vast majority of hospitalized patients are unvaccinated. While the COVID vaccine is freely available in the U.S., there are shortages of it around the world. Most vaccines are going to rich countries. Some of them, like Israel and Germany, have even started offering a third booster shot for COVID. This is while most people around the world remain waiting for their first dose of the vaccine. Here is Tedros Ghebreyesus, Director General of the World Health Organization.
We need an urgent reversal from the majority of vaccines going to high-income countries to the majority going to low-income countries. Accordingly, WHO is calling for a moratorium on boosters until at least the end of September to enable at least 10% of the population of every country to be vaccinated.
Pakistan now requires proof of vaccination needed for restaurants, transportation, and schools. New York City will also require vaccines for entry to restaurants and gyms. U.S. President Joe Biden on Tuesday called on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to resign. This was after an independent investigation found he had sexually harassed multiple women. Governor Cuomo denies the allegations. The investigation, however, found a deeply disturbing yet clear picture of a pattern of abusive behavior by the governor and his senior staff. It was led by New York State Attorney General Letitia James. In a response delivered shortly after the findings became public, Cuomo insists he never touched anyone inappropriately. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met virtually with 11 Muslim frontline workers from around the world. He commended their contributions and sacrifices working on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic to keep people safe. Secretary Blinken emphasized their selfless efforts to ensure the public good during a time of terrible loss and suffering. He said this was a clear and vibrant manifestation of the spirit of the recent Eid al-Adha holiday, which took place on July 20th around most of the world. Among the honorees was Yunus El-Sharqawi, who during the pandemic in Italy volunteered with Brescia Soccorso's ambulance service. He worked throughout the pandemic, helping transport COVID patients between medical facilities and later as an emergency medical first responder. Secretary Blinken was joined by Uzra Zia. She is the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. Pakistan on Friday slammed what it called India's sham protest regarding local legislative assembly elections in Pakistan-administered Kashmir. The elections in Azad Kashmir concluded last Sunday with a victory for the ruling Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf party. India claimed that Pakistan has no locus standi on these Indian territories. Pakistan had said the people of Azad Jammu and Kashmir enjoy the fruits of free and participatory electoral process. This is while Indian-occupied Kashmir bleeds under its illegal occupation. Kashmir has also been on the agenda of the United Nations Security Council since 1948. India revoked Kashmir's formal semi-autonomy of the region on August 5, 2019. This was after putting nearly 8 million people under curfew and shutting down the internet and their communication with the world. Meanwhile, Fabio Massimo Castaldo, Vice President of the European Parliament, and its 15 members on Friday sent a letter to the EU Commission President. They warned of a worsening human rights situation in Kashmir. Castaldo said on Twitter that the EU should use all its leverage and tools to cooperate with India and Pakistan to honor the pledge made to Kashmiris. This pledge was made by the international community to hold a referendum, as well as to implement UN resolutions. About 2,000 students were kidnapped in Nigeria's northern region between January and July this year. Armed gangs frequently attack to kidnap students for ransom. Students are easy prey to extract a maximum amount of ransom, according to Mojid Alabi, a Lagos-based editor at Premium Times. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari warned state governors in May against paying ransoms because they encourage more kidnapping. The U.S. National Council of Churches is demanding that people released from prison after serving sentences for drug felonies be allowed to receive food assistance. Currently, they are banned for life from receiving the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. They also cannot receive temporary assistance for needy families. These programs provide essential assistance to millions struggling with poverty. Without it, people coming out of prison are more likely to commit another crime and return to jail. This especially affects Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Legislation to reverse the ban has been introduced in the House and will be brought to the Senate this week. The MEAL Act would repeal the lifetime ban on food assistance for people returning from prison after serving the sentences for drug felonies. Namibia joined South Africa last week to reject granting Israel observer status at the African Union Commission. The Commission had made the decision in favor of Israel on July 22nd. Penda Nanda is Executive Director of Namibia's Ministry of International Relations and Cooperation. He said in a statement that granting observer status to an occupying power is contrary to the principles and objectives of the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Nanda said it was particularly wrong at this time when the State of Israel is increasing its oppression of the Palestinian people. Earlier, the South African government said it is appalled at the unjust and unwarranted decision of the African Union Commission. Its Department of International Relations and Cooperation said the Commission had taken this decision unilaterally without consultation with its members. Wildfires have now reached the outskirts of Greece's capital, Athens, amid a scorching heat wave. Residents north of the city have been evacuated. The blaze sent a huge cloud of smoke over Athens. The extreme weather has fueled deadly wildfires in Turkey and blazes in Italy, Greece, and Albania. Turkey has suffered the worst fires in at least a decade. Turkish data says that nearly 235,000 acres of land have been burned by wildfires so far this year. Turkish farmers are sheltering their animals on a beach that usually draws tourists as firefighters battle wildfires across the coastal Turkish city of Marmaris. Croatia, Romania, France, and Spain have sent planes, helicopters, and other firefighting equipment. Wildfires are likely to continue as heat warnings have been issued for Bosnia and Herzegovina and Bulgaria as well. Vietnam has overtaken Bangladesh as the world's second top exporter of apparel. The country sold $29 billion worth of clothing to the world in 2020. Bangladesh's ready-made garment exports were valued at $28 billion, according to the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Bangladesh had been the world's second largest garment exporter since 2010, according to WTO rankings. Vietnam gained business after clothing orders moved away from China at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. China remains the world's largest exporter of apparel, with total exports of $142 billion. Ghana has inaugurated a new national mosque. The country's capital, Accra, is now home to West Africa's second biggest mosque. The house of worship was funded by the Turkish government. Ghana's national mosque is said to be a replica of the Blue Mosque in Istanbul. It can hold 15,000 people at a time. It is adorned with hand-drawn calligraphy of verses from the Quran and Carrara marble exterior fittings. The mosque has 4 minarets. Since its opening, it has drawn thousands of Muslim and non-Muslim visitors. Ghana is a country of over 30 million people in West Africa. According to the 2017 census, Muslims make up about 18% of the population of Ghana. Most African slaves brought to the United States during the country's transatlantic slave trade from the 16th to the 19th century were from West Africa. When you ask Google about the oldest university in history, it will show you the University of Bologna in Italy. Well, Ali Khalaf and Saleh Farouk dispute that. Here's their report.
When I search for the oldest university, most websites tell me that that is the University of Bologna in Italy. Well, not true. According to the Guinness World Records and UNESCO, the oldest existing university in the world is the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. It was founded in 859 AD in Fez, Morocco. It has been continually operating since then. That is 229 years before the University of Bologna. It was founded by a Muslim lady named Fatima el-Fihri. It was built as a mosque in the Islamic tradition. Since the Prophet, peace be upon him, started teachings in his mosque, Muslims built learning institutions in the mosque as well. The mosque building itself is also a significant complex of historical Moroccan and Islamic architecture. Some of the alumni and teachers of this university are quite famous scholars. Among them is the great geographer Muhammad el-Idrisi. He created one of the most advanced medieval world maps and described the Americas in the 12th century. One of the greatest Jewish scholars, Maimonides, or Moses bin Maimon in Arabic, was one of its teachers. He was also a personal physician of Salahuddin Ayyubi. The great Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi and the father of sociology Ibn Khaldun were also a part of the University of Al-Qarawiyyin. The university is decorated with Andalusian art bordered with Kufic calligraphy. Its library is home to a number of precious manuscripts, including historic copies of the Quran.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
To get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
We covered the march of Texan leaders and citizens to their state capital last Saturday to protect voting rights. In one of our in-depth analyses, we discussed Texas voting laws in detail. Let's take a look again.
Thank you so much once again. Today, we're quite happy to be joined by Joshua Blank, who is Research Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas in Austin. Joshua, I thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, what do people need to know about these new voting restrictions being introduced to the extent that Democratic politicians felt the need to leave the state of Texas?
Well, I mean, I think the thing to know that a lot of the restrictions we're talking about here in Texas are in response to a number of the provisions made in Harris County here in Texas. And that's the home of Houston, which is one of Texas's and one of the country's largest cities, to make it easier to vote during the coronavirus pandemic. So a large bulk of the laws being discussed here in Texas are ones that would basically take some of the allowances that Harris County made to make it easier to vote, like 24-hour voting, drive-through voting, expansion of mail-in voting, and to make those, to basically make that not an option going forward. Some of the more controversial provisions include giving what we call partisan poll watchers, or people assigned by the parties to go and monitor polling places, more access to voting locations. And the other sort of provision that's really causing a lot of heartburn for Democrats are provisions that would make it more difficult to file to vote by mail, and or for voters with disabilities to vote. And so, you know, in and of itself, these are the provisions that are in the bill. But also, it's hard just to talk about this in terms of Texas, because what the Texas Democrats are reacting to here, as much as what's going on in Texas, is part of a national discussion where Republican legislatures across the country are attempting to create new restrictions around voting in response to the 2020 election. While Democratic voters and Democratic legislators see voter suppression as the real problem.
Now, if you could also talk to us about the parallel thinking between Republicans perhaps arguing that it is essential for election security, while Democrats are arguing in this regard that this would be a supposed attack on the right to vote, given these newfound voting restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, Democrats and Republicans could not come at this issue from two more different vantage points. In lots of polling that we've done at the University of Texas with the Texas Tribune of registered voters here in Texas, we've repeatedly found that among Texas Republicans, there's a widespread belief that fraud is a pervasive problem in the election system. And so we ask, you know, how often do you think that ineligible voters are able to cast votes? Republicans will, you know, the majority of Republicans will say this happens often or frequently, whereas most Democratic voters will say this never or rarely happens. On the flip side, when we ask how often eligible voters are prevented from voting, the vast majority of Texas Democrats say this happens often or frequently, and the vast majority of Texas Republicans say this almost never or rarely happens. And the sum total of this, I think, in the current discussion is when we ask Texas voters whether or not Texas's election system discriminates against racial and ethnic minorities, nearly 4 in 5 Republicans say it doesn't, and nearly the same share of Democrats say it does. And that really points to how intractable this issue is because even though both sides see problems with the voting system, the problems they see are very far apart from each other and require completely different solutions.
For a lot of people, this seems like such an unprecedented way to get the point across concerning how voting should take place. What implications does this move have on lawmaking in the House of Representatives?
Well, it's a tough one. It's a tough one to answer. I think part of this is a reflection of how lawmaking has gone. In Texas, we only have a legislative session for 140 days every 2 years, and it's always a difficult process to fit that much legislation for such a large and diverse state into such a short period of time. This particular regular session was filled with really a number of priorities for Republican elected officials looking ahead to their primary elections and the next cycle. And really, the end of the session, was marked by the animosity between the two parties when the Democrats first broke quorum to stop this election bill the first time. So ultimately, going forward, I think that, the comity between the two parties is gone. And so this is really the tool that Democrats had left at their disposal, but it's really a reflection of the fact that they had no other tools left at their disposal to stop these bills or even to try to make them at least a little bit less unpalatable to them.
Now, from a federal perspective, a lot of people are concerned that the Biden administration aren't really taking seriously the threat to state-level voting laws and those threats that perhaps pose to Democratic candidates in the upcoming elections. In your opinion, do you foresee any action in Congress to present any new national rules around voting?
I think it's a really slim possibility. Ultimately, it would require a change to the Senate filibuster rules that it does not appear that key senators are willing to support. While the Texas situation certainly raises the profile of this issue even further, it has already been a high-profile issue since before the 2020 election. It has not gotten less important or less salient to people since the 2020 election. So I'm not sure that Texas Democrats heading to the federal government really changes the calculus of, a Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia who said he is not for removing the filibuster. This doesn't mean that something couldn't happen in the coming weeks or months that changes the way he thinks about this. But ultimately, I think, the chances that the federal government are coming to save Texas Democrats is pretty slim.
You mentioned the filibuster. So what comes to mind really briefly here is that voting rights bill in the US Senate are stalled by the threat of the filibuster, of course. But isn't this a similar technique being used by Democrats in Texas to block the legislation? I just wanted to get your professional take on that.
Yeah, I mean, they're both examples of the Democrats in Texas on the one hand and Republicans at the federal in the Congress at the federal level on the other hand, using the legislative rules that were laid out and agreed to by members of both parties before their sessions began. Ultimately, the Democrats felt that they were being denied a lot of the sort of the abilities to question the bill and make amendments to it and challenge its constitutionality within the process. And so they chose to break the quorum, which, again, the quorum is established under the rules of the Texas House. Same thing with the Senate. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, and it is simply a rule that the Senate adopts at the beginning of its legislative session for how it's going to operate. And that is a rule that can be used by members of both parties as they see fit.
You mentioned the quorum, and I just wanted to understand, is Texas unique in having this 2/3 quorum?
Almost every legislative body in the country, and even a lot of municipal bodies, have quorum limits. Basically, you need to have a certain minimum number of people show up to a legislative body to do business. And this is to make sure that a minority of members or even just a few members of a legislative body, committee, or otherwise don't show up at an odd time and just start making decisions for the whole body. So usually you require at least a majority of any legislative body to be present before that legislative body can do business. And that's true in Texas. That's true pretty much everywhere as far as I'm concerned.
And as we conclude today, we also wanted to understand, are Democrats correct in taking this fight to Washington, D.C.? And is the solution here only in federal legislation overriding proposed changes to Texas voting laws?
I don't think the only solution is at the federal level. Ultimately, Texas is going to continue to change, and the party system is becoming more competitive, which is why I think there's so much consternation and angst around this issue. These laws are never permanent, and they can be changed and amended going forward. So this doesn't mean that the only solution Texas Democrats have is to go to Washington to look for solutions. I think the thing that they really benefit from at this point is to keep attention on the issue. And just as much as Republicans are focusing on this in a bid to reinforce their reelection campaigns come 2022, Democrats in Texas are doing the exact same thing, and they're fighting for their constituents the only way that they feel that they can be effective at this point.
We're speaking today here with Joshua Blank, who is Research Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas in Austin. Joshua, thank you so much for your time today in light of the voting crisis in Texas.
Thanks for having me.
Back to the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
over in my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. The Biden administration is recalibrating the U.S. government's legal approach to the Guantanamo Bay prison, according to a redacted legal brief filed last Friday. Responding to the Biden administration transferring its first detainee out of Guantanamo Bay, Daphne Eviatar, Amnesty International's director of the Security with Human Rights program, joined us in one of our previous in-depth analysis segments. Let's watch again.
Thank you, Samana. Amnesty International is calling on Biden administration to shut down Guantanamo Bay prison. Well, we have heard that after a while now, but it is still there. President Biden wanted to shut it down, but he couldn't do that. Will President Biden be able to do that? So from Amnesty International, we have its USA Director of Security with Human Rights, Daphne Eviatar. Welcome to Muslim Network TV.
Thanks so much for having me.
So tell us, what's the reason for this for the fresh call?
For the fresh call to close Guantanamo?
Yes.
Well, Guantanamo has been open almost 20 years. So it's been a human rights atrocity since the beginning, and it continues to be. We've been calling for Guantanamo to be closed since it was opened, because it's completely unlawful to have an offshore prison that is designed specifically to hold Muslim men accused of crimes of terrorism without any charge or trial. So that's what it was created for. It was created to be outside the law. It has stayed outside of the law in terms of any reasonable legal procedure that provides due process. And so we're calling for it to be closed. We are hopeful that we finally have an administration who will be willing to close it. And we're beginning to see slow steps, such as the first transfer of a detainee out of there in a long time. But it's not quickly enough. We need to see the other remaining detainees being transferred out quickly.
So Abdul Latif Nasser, who has been transferred to Morocco as a free person, he was set to be released in 2016. He was cleared by 6, 7 agencies. Why then he was unable to be released?
We don't really know. I mean, that's the thing. There's no transparency in this system. We know that during the Obama administration, he did arrange for several people to be released, and then it didn't happen. Tawfiq al-Bahani is another example, who was supposed to go to Saudi Arabia. It just didn't happen. And then when Donald Trump came in and took office, he said nobody's going to be transferred out of there. It was purely politics. He decided to make himself look tough and to make himself to kind of bow to his constituents, his extremist constituents. He said no one's going to be transferred. It had nothing to do with justice. It was completely politics.
How many people are still there after the release of Mr. Nasser?
So now there are 39 men who remain there. And of those, 10 have been cleared for release. So 10 have already been cleared for transfer, some for more than 10 years, and they're still there.
So there are others who have been cleared even before Mr. Nasser, and they're still there. Why? Any idea?
Again, it's politics. Some of it, sometimes there are logistical difficulties, challenges. For example, if someone is from Yemen. The U.S. government has not wanted to return people to Yemen because of security concerns, but those are concerns that all can be overcome. They can be returned, they can be sent to another country that could accept them under conditions where they will be safe there. There are all sorts of arrangements that can be made and then have been made. I mean, keep in mind, there have been about 750 different people who've been through the prison over time, and majority of them were transferred out by the Bush administration, over 500. So there are all sorts of arrangements that can be made. Some of the ones that are remaining there have been tortured by the US government, particularly by the CIA. And so the US is afraid to release them for various reasons. But I think there are no actual obstacles. Mostly this is just politics.
So Daphne, you mentioned there are originally 750 people who are detained. How many were actually tried?
Almost none. There have been 8 people charged in the proceedings. I think I don't remember the exact number where there have been convictions. I know that most of the convictions that there were overturned, but there are fewer. It's a handful. So the vast majority of them were never tried. The vast majority were never even charged. And the military commission system has been so dysfunctional. There's never been a full-fledged trial in a case. So there have been some plea agreements, some kind of under the radar agreements that were made, but the vast majority have never even been charged.
You mentioned that illegal, you used the term illegal. Illegal under which law?
Under international law. The United States government, of course, says it's legal. They say it's legal under the laws of war because they say this is part of a non-international armed conflict. But there's no armed conflict under international law that goes on for 20 years and with a constantly different set of enemies, of declared enemies by the United States. The United States keeps changing who it's fighting. The authorization for use of military force, so the beginning of this so-called war, started when the United States invaded Afghanistan. That was quite a long time ago. That was in 2001. The nature of the conflict that the U.S. is fighting has changed dramatically over time. This is not the same conflict that we're still in. And of course, we're withdrawing our troops from Afghanistan. But the U.S. government continues to maintain that this is an ongoing war, which they themselves say could last 100 years. So it's sort of a farce. International law does not conceive of, it was not created to address the idea of a war that goes on for 100 years. It was talking about wars that go on for a discrete period of time in a discrete geographic location.
Has anyone in the United States tried to use the legal means in the United States to get the Guantanamo Bay closed or challenge the legality of it?
There have been legal processes in the United States that have been brought. They tend to get stuck in the court system. The U.S. court system defers a great deal to the government when it comes to U.S. national security law and policy. So it's very difficult to pursue these cases in the U.S. court system. But there have been cases, and there are still cases pending. But it's very unlikely that the U.S. court system will rule against the U.S. government on this larger question of the legality of Guantanamo.
Now, considering the gentleman Abdul Latif Nasser, who has been just released to Morocco for freedom, who was never charged, who was never tried, who was cleared by all the agencies 6 years ago and was still not released. Reading his detail, it turns out some Afghans, bounty hunter, detained him and sold it to the United States. Now, as Afghan war is coming to close, United States is about to bring tens of thousands of those people who helped the United States. Do you think some of the bounty hunters going to show up here as well?
I don't know. You know, the whole bounty hunter idea was done in a sort of under the radar sense. It was an unofficial agreement with the Afghans to say, give us anyone you suspect of being involved in terrorist activity, which is obviously not a legitimate way of conducting law enforcement, right? So, I think that the US government is trying to bring people here who it wants to protect because those people help the United States and put themselves at risk. But the whole concept where the United States government was paying people money to turn over their enemies, basically, without really any sense of whether those people were actually enemies of the United States or maybe just someone that person had a personal grudge against. It was a nonsensical way of going about it, and it's certainly not a cause for continued detention of anyone after so many years.
Do you really expect Biden administration to actually shut it down, considering that his former boss, President Obama, also tried, decided, and announced, but was unable to do that?
I do hope that they plan to shut it down. I do think that that is the intention. I think they didn't. I think the Biden administration did not come in and make a big announcement the way that President Obama did, because it did not want to encourage a backlash among Republicans and conservatives in this country who, for purely political reasons, want to keep Guantanamo open. So I think it's trying to do some of this under the radar, in a sense, and make less of a big deal out of it so that it can do it more quietly. At least I hope. I'm trying to be hopeful here that they are taking it very seriously and they're trying to close down the prison. I know they believe it should be closed down. The question is politics, and are they willing to push and take a political risk to do it? And this is absolutely the time to do it, and they have the support in Congress right now.
Definitely, these people were, almost all of them were non-US citizens, so we kept them outside the United States technically, although that land belonged to the US in one way or the other. But within the United States, there is a law of the indefinite detention of the US citizens, which President Obama signed into law, saying that my administration will not implement, but he did sign into law. That law still exists. Is there some awareness about that?
Can you be more specific about which law you're referring to in terms of indefinite detention in the United States?
Yes, there was anti-AA during the Obama administration, in which a insertion was of a law that United States government is authorized to detain any US citizen indefinitely if they suspect them of this or that or whatever it is, but about the US citizen. So President Obama signed that, but while signing, he put a note with his pen that my administration will not implement it, instead of vetoing, because it was National Defense Authorization Act. And since then, it has been constantly renewed, and it is legal for any US citizen to be detained indefinitely. Maybe the type of evidence which brought those prisoners of Gitmo there could be used against these people. But whenever I mention that, talk to people, not a whole lot of people know that it's a law. I remember a Council on Foreign Relations meeting where I was invited. I mentioned that there were about 4 or 5 lawyers in that group of 20, 30 people. They said, well, never heard of it. But it is the law. It was signed into law by President Obama, saying that his administration will not implement. To my knowledge, probably it has not been implemented, but that remains a law.
Yeah. One of the challenges of the way the laws are made here, and particularly around the military, so the National Defense Authorization Act, it's an enormous bill, and nobody ever actually reads the whole thing. So a lot of things get slipped in there that people don't realize are in there. So I think if this law were to start being enforced, you would certainly see a lot of challenges to it. If it hasn't been enforced, that might be why we haven't seen the controversy yet.
Thank you so much, Daphne Vidhar. Maybe next time I will ask you a question. If you have a wish list on behalf of Amnesty International, when some bill like 600 pages is being passed, you like to insert in there?
We do. We absolutely do. And we do our best to get those provisions in there. Once in a while, we can be a little bit successful on some of them. But, there are advantages and disadvantages to having a law like that. And it gets passed every year, almost regardless. So it's an opportunity to try to get some good provisions in there. But it also means that sometimes things end up in there that don't make any sense at all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you so much. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.